The challenge begins. Saloth, the renowned combat instructor from the Zarthal Empire, stood in the grand arena. His tall, muscular frame towered over the gathered spectators, his alien features a mix of sharp angles and glowing skin. The crowd, filled with different species from all across the galaxy, murmured in excitement. They had come to watch the legendary Saloth train the next generation of elite warriors. Known for his flawless technique and unmatched strength, Saloth had never been defeated. Not once. Today, however, something was different. There was a new challenger, a human. Saloth sneered at the thought. Humans were a relatively new species in the galaxy, and to most, they were still considered primitive. Their home planet, Earth, was a harsh and unforgiving place, but that didn't mean humans were special. In fact, Saloth had heard rumors about humans' tendency to fight recklessly, without any real discipline or strategy. They relied on raw instincts rather than proper training. Saloth had no doubt that this human would be an easy victory. The human's name was Captain Dax. He was a soldier from Earth who had somehow managed to earn a reputation among the galaxy's more dangerous warriors. Rumors said that he had survived impossible odds on Earth and had fought his way through some of the most brutal environments the universe had ever seen. Still, to Saloth, this was laughable. A soldier from a barbaric planet had no chance against someone like him. The arena floor was a large, circular space, its edges lined with advanced tech displays and the excited faces of the galaxy's elite. Saloth stood in the center, awaiting his opponent. He cracked his knuckles, eager to get this over with. As the doors at the opposite end of the arena opened, Dax walked in. He was tall, like Saloth, but his human frame seemed rougher, less refined. He wore basic combat gear, nothing impressive. Saloth could already see that Dax's posture was stiff, his movements stiff and awkward compared to the natural grace of the Zarthal warriors. The audience's excitement grew as the two fighters locked eyes. Saloth's sharp gaze took in every detail of the human. There was a quiet confidence in Dax's expression, but it wasn't enough to convince the alien. He was about to teach this human a lesson in humility. "You do realize that this is a test, right?" Saloth's voice echoed across the arena, his tone cold and mocking. "A warm-up for the real warriors of the galaxy. Don't disappoint me." Dax didn't respond at first. He only nodded, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. Saloth could see the human's breath steadying, a slight nervousness in his eyes. But Saloth dismissed it. It was normal for humans to be nervous in the face of true strength. "Are you ready?" Saloth asked, his grin widening. Dax nodded again, his eyes narrowing with focus. Without another word, Saloth lunged forward, his speed unimaginable. He was a blur of motion, his long limbs moving with deadly precision. He aimed for Dax's midsection, intending to land the first blow and end this match in seconds. But to his surprise, Dax dodged. The human didn't move like a trained fighter, but he moved with something else, something raw. Saloth's attack barely missed, and the sudden movement threw him off balance for a split second. That was all Dax needed. He lunged forward, aiming a punch at Saloth's shoulder. It wasn't the cleanest strike, but it was powerful, and it landed. Saloth gritted his teeth. His shoulder burned where Dax had struck, and he quickly stepped back to reassess the human. He hadn't expected that. The punch had been unexpected, but he didn't let it faze him. This was just a warm-up after all. "Impressive," Saloth admitted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But you'll need more than that." He rushed in again, this time throwing a series of fast, controlled blows aimed at Dax's head and chest. Each strike was calculated, meant to test the human's ability to defend himself. Saloth moved like a predator, each move an exact replica of his training, every action smooth and efficient. But once again, Dax dodged, twisting his body in a way that seemed unnatural. It was as if he was less concerned with technique and more with instinct. Saloth's strikes missed again, and his eyes flashed with frustration. He had underestimated this human. Dax wasn't skilled in the way Xaloth was used to, but there was something about the human's raw power and unpredictability that kept him on edge. The fight wasn't going as he had planned. Xaloth tried to land a knee to Dax's side, but once again, the human moved. This time, Dax didn't dodge. Instead, he grabbed Xaloth's knee in midair, twisting it, and sending the alien combat instructor crashing to the ground. The audience gasped in shock. Even Xaloth was stunned for a moment. He hadn't expected that level of strength from a human. As Xaloth scrambled to regain his footing, Dax didn't give him a moment to breathe. With one swift motion, he lunged again, grabbing Xaloth's arm and using his momentum to throw him across the arena. The audience was in awe. What they had thought would be an easy match had turned into something unexpected. For the first time, they saw the alien instructor off balance, something no one had ever witnessed before. The crowd began to murmur, unsure of what was happening. The fight had only just begun, and already, the impossible seemed to be happening. Xaloth stood up, his eyes blazing with intensity. He was no longer taking this fight lightly. He was determined to put this human in his place. But deep down, he couldn't help but wonder, was this really just a warm-up, or had he misjudged the human from the very beginning? The challenge had only just begun, and both warriors knew that this fight would change everything. Underestimating the human. Xaloth's pride burned with a sharp, intense heat as he steadied himself. His mind raced, replaying the events of the last few minutes. The human, Captain Dax, had done something unimaginable. He had actually forced Xaloth to the ground. A mere human, someone from a primitive planet, had humbled the galaxy's most elite combat instructor. This was an offense Xaloth couldn't simply ignore. He took a deep breath and stood tall, shaking off the shock. His instincts kicked in. He was an elite fighter, trained in combat techniques that had been perfected over millennia. He had faced entire armies, fought across countless worlds, and emerged victorious every time. There was no way a human could best him. Not if he was serious. Dax, meanwhile, stood across from him, his posture low and ready. His face remained calm, yet there was a glint in his eyes that suggested something more, a hidden strength that Xaloth hadn't anticipated. Dax wasn't just relying on instinct anymore. He was starting to adapt, to think in the moment. Xaloth couldn't deny it. This human had more to offer than he first thought. With a growl of determination, Xaloth lunged forward again. This time, he was quicker, more aggressive. He aimed a swift punch at Dax's chest, but the human dodged to the side with an ease that startled him. Xaloth's fist slammed into the ground where Dax had been standing just moments before. This time, I won't miss, Xaloth muttered to himself, pushing forward. But Dax wasn't where Xaloth expected him to be. Instead of retreating or dodging, Dax closed the distance between them, moving in a blur. Xaloth's eyes widened as Dax's elbow came crashing into his ribs. The force of the blow knocked the wind out of him, and for the first time in this fight, Xaloth felt a surge of real pain. The crowd roared in disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. No one had ever managed to land a hit on Xaloth, let alone force him to stagger. But Dax, with his unpredictable style, was doing the unthinkable. Xaloth staggered back, barely keeping his feet beneath him. His body burned with the effort, his muscles screaming for a break. He could feel the blood rising in his chest, and his pride stung even more than the physical pain. No one had ever made him feel this vulnerable. Dax didn't stop. With a speed Xaloth hadn't expected, he followed up with another attack, this time going for Xaloth's legs. Dax's foot connected with Xaloth's knee, causing a sharp crack that echoed through the arena. The alien instructor felt his leg buckle under the weight of the blow, and he collapsed to the ground, momentarily stunned. For a split second, everything went silent. The crowd held their breath, waiting for Xaloth to rise again and show them why he was the best. But as Xaloth struggled to push himself up, something inside him clicked. The human wasn't just lucky, he was powerful. and he was getting stronger with every passing moment. Zaloth clenched his teeth and forced himself to stand, his legs wobbling beneath him. His eyes locked on Dax, who was now watching him carefully, waiting for the next move. This was no longer just a warm-up. This was real. Zaloth straightened up and wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands shaking with frustration. He had been humiliated, yes, but that was the nature of combat. He'd faced worse before, and he would get through this, just like always. He took a deep breath and squared his shoulders, preparing for the next round. This time, he wouldn't hold back. This time, he would break the human. "You're quick," Zaloth said, his voice low and dangerous. "But speed won't save you forever." Dax's response was calm, almost too calm. "We'll see." Without waiting for Zaloth to make the first move, Dax charged again. This time, there was no hesitation in his steps. Zaloth quickly countered, using his full strength to push Dax back, but the human was relentless. He shifted his weight, ducking under Zaloth's strike, and coming up with a swift knee to the alien's midsection. Zaloth grunted, the force of the impact rattling his rib cage. The pain was sharp, but he gritted his teeth and retaliated, swinging his elbow into Dax's side. The human stumbled back for a moment, but only to regain his balance. Dax's face showed no signs of exhaustion, his breath steady, his movements calculated. Zaloth realized with sudden clarity that this human was something different. He didn't fight with the calculated precision of an elite warrior, but he fought with an intensity that was hard to ignore. He fought like someone who had never been given a chance but had survived anyway. And in that, Zaloth could see the true threat. The alien instructor backed up, wiping the blood from his lips, his thoughts racing. Dax had shown him something he hadn't expected, a fighting style that didn't rely on finesse or elegance, but on survival instincts honed by years of struggle on Earth's harshest environments. This was a fight for the ages, a true challenge. As Zaloth prepared himself for the next strike, the audience grew restless. They had never seen anything like this before. Would Zaloth regain control, or would the human continue to defy all expectations? But the question was in Zaloth's mind now, too. Was he really in control, or had he already underestimated this human too much? The tables turn. Zaloth's mind raced, his thoughts clouded by both anger and a growing sense of disbelief. The pain in his side was becoming harder to ignore, a constant reminder of the human's resilience. Dax's strikes were sharp, quick, and precise, each one seemingly calculated to target Zaloth's weakest points. It was becoming clear that this human wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting to win. And that, Zaloth realized, was the difference. For the first time in his career, Zaloth felt truly challenged. His opponent wasn't just some novice or overconfident warrior. Dax wasn't playing by the usual rules of combat that Zaloth had mastered. Instead, he was bending them, making the fight unpredictable and chaotic. And that chaos was making Zaloth uncomfortable. Zaloth shifted his weight, preparing to launch another attack. He needed to end this. Now, he couldn't allow himself to be bested by a human, no matter how skilled or unorthodox his techniques were. With a snarl, he lunged forward, his powerful arm aiming to strike Dax down. But Dax was already moving, already anticipating the strike. He dodged to the side, his movements fluid, almost too fast for Zaloth to follow. In a split second, Dax closed the distance between them, landing a punch directly into Zaloth's chest. The blow was so powerful that it left the alien combat instructor gasping for air, momentarily stunned. Zaloth staggered back, his vision momentarily blurred by the intensity of the impact. His body screamed for rest, for relief, but there was no time. He had to fight back. Dax didn't give him the chance to recover. Before Zaloth could even fully regain his footing, Dax was already upon him again. This time, he grabbed Zaloth by the arm and twisted it behind the alien's back with a force that made Zaloth's joints protest. The crowd roared in shock, their disbelief palpable as they watched the impossible unfold before them. Zaloth gritted his teeth and slammed his knee into Dax's stomach, forcing the human to release his grip. He spun around quickly, intending to retaliate, but his movements were slower now, more sluggish. The weariness was setting in. His strength was failing him, but Dax seemed as sharp as ever, his energy never waning. Dax's eyes locked onto Zaloth with an intensity that made the alien's heart skip a beat. This wasn't just a fight anymore. It had become something more, something personal. Zaloth had never expected to feel this way. He had always been the one in control. He had always been the one to dictate the pace. But now he was being pushed to his limits, and the one thing Zaloth couldn't afford to do was show weakness. In a final desperate attempt to regain the upper hand, Zaloth gathered all the strength he had left and swung his fists in a wide arc, aiming for Dax's head. The human dodged again, but this time Zaloth anticipated the movement. He twisted mid-strike, following through with a powerful elbow aimed directly at Dax's jaw. The blow landed, but instead of knocking Dax out, the impact only seemed to fuel the human's resolve. He shook his head and grinned, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. "Is that the best you've got?" Dax taunted, his voice a mix of amusement and challenge. Zaloth's chest tightened. His arrogance had always been his greatest strength, but now it was becoming his greatest weakness. He had underestimated this human at every turn. Dax wasn't intimidated. He wasn't backing down. The human was relentless, and Zaloth could feel his control slipping away. Suddenly, Dax took a step back, lowering his stance. "Come on, Zaloth. You were supposed to be the galaxy's best, right?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm waiting." Zaloth's heart pounded in his chest. This was more than a fight. This was a test of everything he stood for, everything he had fought for. And right now, he wasn't sure if he was going to win. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The sounds of the crowd faded into the background as Zaloth's focus narrowed to Dax's every movement. The human was still standing, still in the fight, and Zaloth realized that if he didn't act fast, he might not get another chance. The alien combat instructor's mind raced. He had one shot at this, one opportunity to turn the tide. His pride couldn't allow him to be bested, not by a human. Zaloth moved forward again, more cautiously this time. He couldn't afford to make another mistake. But Dax was ready. With the quickness of a predator, he sidestepped Zaloth's attack and grabbed the alien's arm, twisting it at an unnatural angle. Zaloth's knees buckled from the pressure, and for the first time in this fight, he felt genuine fear. Dax's voice was low and steady, almost a whisper as he said, "You should have stayed down. Zaloth, this is my fight now." Zaloth's mind raced as he realized the truth. He wasn't just fighting for his pride anymore. He was fighting for survival. And if he didn't do something quickly, this would be the last fight he ever had. The tables had truly turned. The breaking point. Zaloth's mind was clouded, his thoughts racing. But no matter how fast he processed, he could not escape the fact that the fight was slipping away from him. The human, this Deathworlder, this anomaly, was unlike anything Zaloth had ever encountered. His body screamed with exhaustion, and yet he couldn't afford to give in. To do so would be a blow to everything he had ever known. The pressure on his arm intensified, and Zaloth's knees began to buckle further under the strain. He had fought countless battles, but none like this. This human was fighting not just with his body, but with an overwhelming force of will. Every move Dax made was calculated, measured, and full of purpose. There was no waste, no hesitation. He was a force of nature. "You're strong," Zaloth gritted out, his voice strained. "But you don't understand what you're dealing with." "You talk too much," Dax interrupted, his voice filled with a confidence that only fueled Zaloth's anger. "You said you wanted a real fight, right? This is it. "You're just not used to losing." The words stung, and Zaloff fought to push them out of his mind. Losing? Was he really losing? He was the best combat instructor in the galaxy, feared and respected by all. And here he was, on the verge of being beaten by a mere human. His pride flared, and for a moment, his ego blinded him to everything but the desire to regain control. But that very pride was his downfall. In an explosive burst of energy, Zaloff fought against Dax's hold, using his other arm to lash out. The strike was swift and vicious, but Dax anticipated it. With a fluid movement, Dax ducked and countered, sending Zaloff sprawling to the ground. The crowd erupted in a mix of shock and awe. Zaloff's breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to push himself up. His body felt like lead, every joint aching with the effort. But he couldn't stay down. Not now. Not in front of all these witnesses. He had to finish this. But as he stood, his vision blurred for a moment, and in that split second of weakness, Dax was on him. With the precision of a seasoned fighter, Dax grabbed him by the shoulders and spun him around. Zaloff found himself face to face with the ground, his back exposed, and Dax's knee pressed into the small of his back. "You should have stayed down," Dax repeated, his voice calm, yet carrying the weight of finality. "This is your last chance, Zaloff." Zaloff's heart raced in his chest. His pride was shattered, his body broken, and the truth began to settle in like a cold, heavy weight. The human wasn't just skilled. He was a warrior through and through, and Zaloff had underestimated him at every turn. This human, this Deathworlder, was not like the others. There was something in him, something primal, that Zaloff had never encountered before. He had been too arrogant to see it. The crowd was silent now, watching in disbelief as their once indomitable champion was brought to his knees by a single human. Zaloff's mind raced, grasping for any last bit of energy, but there was nothing left. The fight had drained him, and there was no more strength to muster. Dax's grip tightened on his shoulder, forcing Zaloff to meet the human's gaze. There was no malice in Dax's eyes, no hate, just the quiet certainty that the fight was over. Zaloff opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to somehow regain some measure of his dignity, but the words wouldn't come. His body betrayed him. His ego betrayed him. And in that silence, Dax finally spoke again. "It's over, Zaloff. You've been humbled. The galaxy has a new champion now." And as Zaloff lay there, gasping for breath, he realized that Dax was right. The fight was over. He had lost. But what struck him the most was the feeling that he wasn't just beaten by strength alone. He was beaten by the human's heart. Dax had fought with a ferocity that Zaloff had never seen before, a fire that came from something deeper than training, deeper than skill. It was the spirit of a Deathworlder, and Zaloff was powerless against it. The arena fell into a hushed silence, the weight of the moment sinking in. Zaloff was not just defeated. He was completely and utterly humbled by a force he had never even considered. And as the human stood over him, victorious, Zaloff could do nothing but stare in stunned silence, finally understanding the truth. The tables had not only turned. They had been completely and utterly shattered. The unexpected savior. The arena remained eerily silent as Dax stood over Zaloff, his chest rising and falling with each heavy breath. His body was battered, bruised from the fight, but his spirit remained unbroken. He had done it. He had taken down the galaxy's most feared combat instructor. But as the realization settled in, something else began to stir within him, an unfamiliar sensation. He looked down at the alien who had been his opponent. Zaloff's body was still, his eyes closed, and though the battle was over, there was no sign of triumph in Dax's heart. The fight had taken everything from both of them, but it was Zaloff's spirit that lingered in Dax's mind. The battle had shown him a truth he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about strength. It was about endurance, about the heart that carried one through every blow. And now, as Dax stood over the defeated Zaloff, something strange happened. Zaloff stirred. His eyes slowly opened, the intensity of the moment still fresh in his gaze. Dax stepped back, watching as the alien combat instructor pushed himself up, his movements slow and labored, the pain clearly evident in every movement. The crowd watched in suspense. The battle wasn't just between two warriors. It was a spectacle, a clash of cultures, of pride and resilience. And now, it seemed, something else was unfolding. Zaloff's eyes met Dax's, and for a brief moment, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding. "Well fought," Zaloff said, his voice rough, each word clearly a struggle. "You are worthy." Dax didn't speak at first. He wasn't sure what to say. He had been trained to fight, to win, but there was no real victory in what had just happened. He had won the fight, but in doing so, he had also learned something about respect. Respect for his enemy, and respect for the very spirit that had pushed him to keep fighting, even when he was at his limits. "You're not bad yourself," Dax replied with a slight grin. "You almost had me there a couple of times." Zaloff managed a weak chuckle, but it was clear that the fight had taken its toll on him. "The fight wasn't what I expected, but I have learned something today." Dax nodded. "Me too." For a moment, they simply stood there, the tension of the fight still hanging in the air, but a new understanding between them starting to form. They weren't enemies anymore, not in the way that the galaxy might have expected. The fight had changed something inside both of them. The mutual respect between the two warriors was undeniable, even if they still came from vastly different worlds. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the arena erupted into cheers. The crowd had been silent for far too long, and now the realization had sunk in. Dax, the human from a dangerous Deathworld, had defeated the legendary combat instructor, Zaloff. The cheers echoed through the space, a mixture of awe, disbelief, and admiration. Dax looked around, hearing the rising sounds of victory, but his eyes remained on Zaloff. The alien combat instructor, who had once been so confident in his invincibility, now stood humbled. And yet, in that moment, Dax couldn't help but feel that the battle was far from over. There were more challenges waiting for him, but now he knew he wasn't alone. He had earned the respect of one of the galaxy's greatest fighters, and that respect meant more to him than any applause from the crowd. Zaloff, still breathing heavily, finally straightened up. "You have earned your place in the galaxy's history, human." Dax raised an eyebrow. "We're both making history today, aren't we?" Zaloff looked at him, his expression serious yet tinged with respect. "I was wrong. You are no mere human. You are something more." Dax smiled faintly, realizing the depth of the statement. He wasn't just a human anymore. He was a force to be reckoned with, a true warrior. As the applause grew louder and louder, Dax turned to face the crowd. He knew that this victory would echo throughout the galaxy. But more than that, it had changed him. He had faced down a legend and come out victorious, not through sheer strength, but through his own will to survive. And as the last echoes of the crowd's cheers rang in his ears, Dax knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The story of the Deathworlder and the alien combat instructor had just begun. The aftermath. The cheers of the crowd still rang in Dax's ears as he stood in the center of the arena, the weight of victory settling in. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, sweat mingling with the dirt and blood from the fight. But despite the pain, there was a strange sense of calm in him. He had done it. He had proven himself. Yet, as he looked around, something didn't sit right. The adrenaline was fading, and with it, a feeling of unease crept in. The alien spectators who had gathered for the spectacle now stood frozen, their eyes fixed on him. The same ones who had cheered for Zaloff, now silent, unsure of how to react to this unexpected turn of events. Dax's gaze drifted back to Zaloff, who had finally managed to stand, though clearly struggling. His once pristine armor was battered and dented, a testament to the intensity of their battle. The fight had been fierce, but now the reality was setting in. Zoloff, the renowned combat instructor, was no longer the undefeated champion. He was just another soldier who had been defeated in combat. The two warriors locked eyes, and for a moment, the entire arena seemed to fade away. Dax could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. What would come next? Zoloff, still panting, took a step forward, his eyes steady. "You have earned your victory, human," he said, his voice rough but filled with sincerity. "But understand this. The galaxy is watching you now. You have made an enemy of more than just me today." Dax's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Zoloff's expression hardened, a flicker of something darker flashing in his eyes. "The galaxy doesn't take kindly to such unexpected outcomes. You may have beaten me, but there are those who will never accept a human defeating one of their own. There are factions that will want revenge for what has happened here." Dax's heart skipped a beat. He had known the stakes were high, but he hadn't anticipated the kind of attention his victory would bring. He had just become a symbol, a lightning rod for the galaxy's shifting power dynamics. He hadn't just defeated a legendary warrior. He had made himself a target. "You don't have to worry about me," Dax replied, standing tall. "I didn't come here to make enemies. But if they want a fight, they'll get one." Zoloff's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand, human. It's not about fighting. It's about survival. You have just drawn the attention of forces far beyond what you can handle. You may be strong, but there are enemies who will stop at nothing to erase what you've done here." For a moment, Dax considered Zoloff's words. The alien's tone had shifted, no longer filled with arrogance, but with something else. Fear. No, it couldn't be fear. Zoloff had seen battles, wars, and galactic upheaval. He didn't fear anything. But there was something in his voice now, something that made Dax pause. Suddenly, the announcer's voice boomed over the speakers, pulling Dax out of his thoughts. "The winner of the combat challenge is the human Deathworlder." The crowd's cheer was deafening, but it was a hollow sound, distant, as if the reality of the situation hadn't fully sunk in yet. Dax stood still, eyes locked on Zoloff. The fight was over, but the war, whatever that meant, had only just begun. Behind him, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, cloaked being whose presence seemed to suck the air out of the room. Dax turned sharply, narrowing his eyes as the figure approached. The being's face was hidden, but the air around them crackled with power. "You should heed his warning, human," the mysterious figure said, their voice a deep, melodic hum. "There are forces at play here that even you cannot comprehend." Dax didn't back down. "Who are you?" The figure stepped into the light, revealing their alien features. "I am someone who understands the consequences of such an act. You've made waves across the galaxy today, and there are many who will not tolerate your existence, your kind, in this galaxy." Dax clenched his fists, ready for whatever came next. "I didn't ask for this fight, but I'm ready for whatever comes. You can try to stop me, but you'll have to go through me first." The cloaked figure seemed to study him for a moment, their gaze sharp and calculating. "Perhaps you're right. But understand this. The galaxy has always feared the Deathworlders. You may have earned your place here today, but that doesn't mean you will be welcomed. There are those who would rather see you erased." Zoloff, still standing nearby, grimaced at the words. "You have no idea what you've done, human. No idea." Dax turned to Zoloff, his eyes hard. "Then it looks like I'll find out soon enough." With that, the figure turned away, their silhouette vanishing into the crowd, leaving a chilling silence in their wake. The victory, once so sweet, now tasted bitter. Dax had won the fight, but he had unknowingly drawn the attention of forces far beyond his understanding. A target was on his back, and the true fight had only just begun. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, Dax realized something. He had no choice but to prepare for the storm that was coming. His fight was no longer just about proving himself. It was about survival. And in the galaxy, survival was the only thing that mattered. With one final glance at the departing figure, Dax turned and walked away, knowing that the real war was just beginning. The calm before the storm. Dax left the arena, his footsteps echoing in the cold silence that followed the chaos. The crowd had dispersed, but the tension in the air lingered, thick and oppressive. The loud cheers from before had now been replaced by hushed whispers and uneasy glances. As the victor of the battle, he should have been celebrated, but instead, he felt the weight of the galaxy's gaze upon him. He moved through the corridors of the arena, his mind racing. The mysterious figure who had spoken to him, Salaf's ominous words, and the eerie silence of the crowd. It was all too much. What had he gotten himself into? Dax paused, leaning against a cold stone wall as his thoughts swirled. The fight had been hard, but it had also taught him something crucial about his own strength, his own abilities. He had gone up against Salaf, one of the most skilled combatants in the galaxy, and he had emerged victorious. But the consequences of that victory were far beyond what he had expected. He had drawn attention, dangerous attention. And now, it seemed, the galaxy was holding its breath, waiting for the fallout. Dax's eyes narrowed. He had always known that his presence in the galaxy would be a problem. Deathworlders were feared, despised even. But now he had made an enemy of more than just Salaf. The galaxy would never forget the human who defeated their greatest warrior. But what could they do? He wasn't about to run. He wasn't about to hide. If the galaxy wanted war, they would get it. Human, a voice called out behind him. Dax spun, his hand instinctively moving to the weapon at his side. But when he saw who it was, he relaxed. It was a familiar face. Vera, the mechanic who had helped him prepare for the battle. She looked as tense as he felt, her eyes scanning the dark hallway around them. "You're not safe here," she said, her voice low but urgent. "There are whispers. People are already moving, preparing for something. They're going to come after you." Dax sighed, feeling the weight of the situation crashing down on him. He had known this was coming. He had expected the backlash, the consequences, but hearing it from someone else made it all the more real. "I know," he replied, his voice heavy, "but I'm not going anywhere." Vera studied him, her eyes sharp. "You're making a mistake. You may have won this fight, but the galaxy doesn't work that way. You're not just up against Salaf anymore. You've made enemies with entire factions, with powers far beyond anything you've ever dealt with." Dax nodded, though he wasn't fully convinced. "I'm not afraid of them. They can try to stop me, but they'll have to come through me first." Vera's expression softened, but there was still a trace of concern in her eyes. "I'm not saying you should be afraid. I'm saying you need to be prepared. These enemies are not like any you've faced before. They have resources, connections, and armies. You won't be able to fight them alone." Dax's eyes hardened. "I don't need anyone. I've fought for my life every day on my death world. I can handle whatever comes next." Vera didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not alone, Dax. You have more allies than you think. There are others out there who are willing to fight by your side." Dax's mind whirled as he considered her words. Allies? Would anyone truly be willing to stand with a human, especially one who had just shaken the very foundations of the galaxy by defeating Salaf? He wasn't sure, but the idea of having support, of not facing the storm alone, was a comforting thought. But that was something to consider later. Right now, the first priority was survival. The galaxy had just taken notice of him, and that meant the fight was far from over. The victory that had felt so sweet was now the beginning of something much darker. A war that would stretch across the stars, pulling him into its depths whether he wanted it or not. "We'll see," Dax said, his voice firm, though a small part of him wondered if he was fooling himself. "I can handle it." Vera seemed to hesitate for a moment, then nodded. "Just remember, Dax, you're not invincible. No one is." Dax looked at her, giving her a small, reassuring smile. "I've made it this far, and I'm not stopping now." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of what was to come hanging heavily in the air. But in that silence, Dax felt something stir deep within him. It wasn't fear, but resolve. The fight had only just begun, and he wouldn't back down. "You'd better get ready," Vera said, breaking the silence. "Because there's a storm coming. And it's coming for you." Dax nodded. "I know, but I'll be ready. I'll make sure of it." With that, he turned and walked away, his eyes set on the future. Whatever the galaxy had in store for him, he would face it head-on. The battle was far from over.